Chapter 17 of The Adopting of Rosa Marie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria de Fátima da Silva. The Adopting of Rosa Marie by Carol Watson Rankin. An invitation. Betty, asked Jean, when the girls were hustling up the chocolate in Mrs. Mapes' kitchen. The weather was now too cold for Dandelion Cottage to be habitable. "Where did you find her?" "At school," replied Betty. "She comes in for domestic science. I've seen her about 3 times, and every time she's had that stiff Miss Rossiter laughing. You know who that girl is, don't you?" "I've heard something," said Marjorie, "but I can't just remember what, about some girl named Henrietta." "Well, you've seen Mrs. Howard Slater." All the girls had seen Mrs. Slater, the beautifully gowned, decidedly aristocratic old lady with abundant but perfectly white hair and bright, sparkling black eyes. Mrs. Slater, who seemed a very reserved and exclusive person, had spent many summers and even an occasional winter in her own handsome home in Lakeville. She lived alone except for a number of servants, for both her son and her daughter were married. The son lived abroad, no one knew just where, and some 4 years previously Mrs. Slater's daughter, who was Henrietta's mother, had died in Rome. Since that event Henrietta had been cared for by her uncle's wife, and she had spent a winter in California and another in Florida with her grandmother, but this was her first visit to Lakeville. It was said that Henrietta's mother had left her little daughter a very respectable fortune, but her father, an English traveler of note, was also wealthy, and it was known to a certainty that Mrs. Howard Slater was a moneyed person. "Yes," said Marjorie, replying to Betty's question. "We sit behind Mrs. Slater in church, and she's the very daintiest old lady that ever lived. She's as slim and straight as any young girl. She's perfectly lovely to look at, but—" "Yes, but," agreed Jean, "she seems very proud and not very get-nearable. I don't know whether I'd like to live with her or not, but I know I'd feel terribly set up to own a few relatives that looked like that." "How do you like Henrietta?" asked Mabel. "I don't know," said Betty. "Neither do I," replied Jean. "It takes time," declared Marjorie, "to discover whether you like a person or not. And when it's such a different person, truly, she isn't a bit like any other girl in this town. It takes longer." "The chocolate's ready," announced Jean, opening a box of wafers. "Here, Betty, you carry Henrietta's cup and I'll take these. Let's all have our chocolate on the sidewalk." Henrietta, her hands in her pockets, was leaning against the fence and humming a tune. Her voice in speaking was very nicely modulated, which was fortunate because she used it a great deal. She straightened up when the door opened. "I'm an icicle," said she. "I hope that chocolate's good and hot. My, what a nice big cup! And wafers! I'm glad I stayed for your party. I've had chocolate in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Switzerland, and in England, but I do believe this is the very first time I've had any in America." "I'm sorry," said Jean, "that you have to have your first on the sidewalk." "I shan't next time," promised Henrietta. "I have a beautiful plan. I made it while waiting for the chocolate. You're all to come after school tomorrow and pay me a formal call. Then I'll return it. After that I suspect I shall be allowed to run in. But first you'll have to call, formally." "A formal call?" gasped Betty. "We never made a formal call in all our lives," objected Jean. "They're dreadful," agreed Henrietta, "but in this case you really have to do it. I've planned it all nicely. In the first place, you must hand your cards to the butler." "Cards!" gasped Jean and Betty. "Cards!" snorted Mabel, flushing indignantly. "We haven't a card to our names." "You must have them," declared Henrietta firmly, "or Simmons may consider you suspicious characters. Simmons is a very lofty person. You can write some, you know, because Simmons holds his chin so high that it interferes with the view, so he'll never know what's on them. Then you must be very polite to grandmother and say, "Yes, ma'am," "No, ma'am," "Thank you, ma'am," and not very much else. You've seen grandmother, of course. Then you know how very formal and stiff she looks. Well, you must be like that too. "I'll try," said Mabel, "but it'll be pretty hard work." "Be sure to wear gloves," cautioned Henrietta. "Grandma is exceedingly particular about shoes and gloves. I know it's a lot of trouble, but you'll find it pays, for after you've beaten down the icy barrier that surrounds me, you'll find me quite a comfortable person. And do come, just as early as you can. I'm really desperately lonely." This was a different Henrietta from the merry one that Betty had encountered. That other Henrietta had made her laugh. This one, with the wistful, sorrowful countenance and the 4 words, "I'm really desperately lonely," was almost moving her to tears. "You'll surely come," pleaded Henrietta. "We'll come," promised Betty, "cards and all." "Au revoir," said Henrietta, carefully balancing her cup on the top rail of the fence. "I must run along now to try on my clothes." "Was that French?" queried Mabel, gazing after the departing figure. "I think so," replied Jean. "She can certainly talk English fast enough," said Marjorie. "I suppose just one language isn't enough for anybody that chatters like that." "Do you think," asked Betty, "she meant all that about cards and gloves and butlers? She's so full of fun most of the time that I don't exactly know whether to believe her or not." "I think she did," said Marjorie. "You see, I sit behind Mrs. Slater in church, and I'm thankful that it's behind." "Perhaps that's the reason," ventured Betty, "that nobody'll rent the 3 pews in front of her. Father says it's hard to even give them away. No one likes to sit in them." "That's it," agreed Marjorie. "One would have to be sure that her back hair was absolutely perfect to be at all comfortable in front of Mrs. Slater." "And that," groaned discouraged Mabel, "is the sort of person I'm to make my first formal call on." "You'd better take your bath tonight," advised Jean, "and lay out all your very best clothes. And don't forget to polish your shoes." "Father has some blind cards," said Betty, "and he writes beautifully. I'll get him to do cards for all of us." "I think," said Marjorie, with a puzzled air, "that we ought to take 5 or 6 apiece. I know Auntie Jane leaves a whole lot at one house, sometimes." "No," corrected Jean, "we need just 2. One for Mrs. Slater and one for Henrietta. My aunt, Mrs. Halliday, always gets 2 whenever her sister-in-law is visiting there." "There are holes in my best gloves," mourned Betty. "They came in a missionary box, and missionary gloves are never very good even to start with. Besides, Dick wore them first. I never had a new pair of kid gloves." "Never mind," said always generous Mabel. "I must have about 6 pairs, and I've never had any of the things on. I know I've outgrown some of them. Your hands are lots smaller than mine. Come over and I'll fix you out. Mother said we'd have to give them to somebody, and I guess you're just exactly the right somebody. I hate the thing myself." "Goody!" rejoiced Betty. "I wish," said Jean, "that my shoes were newer, but I'll get the boys to black 'em." "I can't help you out," laughed Mabel. "My shoes are short and fat, and yours are long and slim." "A coat of Wallace's blacking will be all that's needed, thank you, Mabel. There's nothing like having brothers when it comes to blacking shoes." "We'll have to get up a little earlier tomorrow morning," said Marjorie. "Mercy!" exclaimed Jean. "Are you leaving all those chocolate cups on the fence for me to carry in?" "Of course not," said obliging Betty, seizing 2. "Come on, you lazy people." End of chapter 17.